The Silence appeared in 1963, and I went to Sweden to write about it for the Financial Times. And I remember meeting Gunnar Björnstrand in the lobby of the hotel, and he asked if I'd seen it, and he said, "Pretty strong stuff, isn't it?" And he said it with a very stern face. And of course, it was an enormously controversial picture at the time. The Silence really did strike a nerve in many European countries, particularly in Germany, where there was a long debate before Atlas Film could release it with cuts. One was the scene in the cabaret where the dwarves are on stage and a couple are making love in among the seats. That was not par for the course in 1963 European cinema. In France, the Minister of Culture did not want to grant a censorship certificate to the film. There was a big battle over that. It was shown in England with very small cuts, and I think in America comparatively unscathed. But the result of this was that it had a succès d'estime and got a huge number of viewers compared with the average Bergman film. And Bergman was rather amused by all this and said, "This film is going to have more unwanted viewers than any film I've ever made." I think in terms of attendances, The Silence is the most popular of all Ingmar Bergman's films. But to a serious note, The Silence was stunning because of the way it looked. I think that was the overriding impact of it. It's starting with this extraordinary train journey into, I don't know, into a kind of no man's land with tanks hurtling past on the outside and the arrival in a city where an emaciated horse goes through the town dragging a wagon. It was almost as though Bergman was on the side of people like Antonioni or authors like Rob Grillet and Beckett, who felt that man had reached a real impasse at the beginning of the 60s. He'd gone as far as he could go. To that extent, it was a very pessimistic film. But it was also extraordinary in the way it used this artificial location of a hotel in a place that's remote from our normal experience. So the hotel was very old and baroque and everything like that, but you couldn't understand a word of what anyone said. There didn't seem to be any other guests except a troupe of dwarfs. And in the city itself, there's a kind of mood of impending war. There are preparations for battle, and you hear sirens off screen, and there's a sense of impending doom almost. So the film was very, very arresting. When last year in Marienbad came out in 1961, we were all stunned by Alain René's and Sacha Vierny, his cameraman's, wonderful gliding tracking shots down the corridor of that very strange hotel in Marienbad. And when we saw The Silence, I think it was the same. Nyqvist uses a very fluent camera to go down these hotel corridors and sweep round corners. And at times it almost becomes subjective through the eyes of the small boy. And that was something we weren't used to. Bergman, on the whole, used a still camera throughout the 50s. He very rarely moved his camera. And if he did, it was a quick whip pan or a quick dolly into a face. And suddenly in The Silence, even though the hotel was a claustrophobic site, he opened it up by this sort of whirling movement and added a feeling, I think, of unease and suspense as a result. Bergman has always loved the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and in a central scene in The Silence, he uses that music, specifically the Goldberg variations, to show a channel of communication between Esther and the waiter in this strange hotel.
Vad heter det? Musik?
Musik.
Sebastian Bach?
Sebastian Bach. Johann Sebastian Bach.
The waiter recognizes the music on the radio, and Esther also recognizes it, and they smile in complicity because that way they are able to reach out to each other through this very, very moving and very soothing music, which was written by Bach actually for someone like Esther. Very often in Bergman, particularly in the 50s, he had created opposing pairs of characters, and those two pairs are like the yin and the yang. They are the two sides of our mind. And in the silence, Esther represents the intellectual side, but also the arid side of our life, and Anna represents the carnal, the sensual side. And there's a beautiful scene that illustrates this in the film when she's in a bath and her son Johann scrubs her back, and there's something very warm and sensual in this. There's a real relationship between them, which is quite innocent, but it's also got a kind of incipient eroticism about it. Whereas Esther has to masturbate on a bed and smoke cigarettes all the time, and she is completely the sort of crabbed, ascetic kind of person. So there were two parts of the same character. And Gunnar Lindblom was a wonderful foil for Ingrid Thulin. We'd known Ingrid Thulin through so many great films like Wild Strawberries, but really this was a tremendous film for both of them. It was particularly arresting because of the revelation of Gunnar Lindblom as the figure of Anna. She was actually married to a gynecologist who was a close friend of Bergman, and she was very, very good on the stage. She'd been a wonderful Margareta in his 1959 production of Urfaust, but she had not been really in films before, except for the sister in Virgin Spring, which was a supporting role. But suddenly she had this major part, and she revealed herself as the carnal side of the human personality. Bergman had never used children in his films except for occasional walk-on parts. But in The Silence we have the figure of Johann, who's a boy, I suppose, of about 9 or 10 in the film, maybe even younger. And he would significantly appear again at the beginning of Persona, which Bergman made a few years later. Johann, I think, represents for Bergman something unspoilt. He is not cynical. He is not inured to the woes of the world as his aunt and his mother are. He's not a party to their quarrels. He just watches them. We see him going through the corridors of the hotel, looking up at paintings. He mixes with the waiter, he mixes with the dwarves, and he's curious, whereas the other two are not curious. And the one time that Anna goes out, it's really just to find a man, basically, to pick up somebody in a cafe. And I think that Johann represents an openness which they have long lost, actually. He is eager to learn something from this journey they make to this strange city. He's also the only one who can consort with the dwarfs who are in the hotel. And I think the dwarves in The Silence are very interesting. They are entirely relaxed with themselves, and they interact with each other in a far more normal way than the so-called normal human beings who mock them. And that's Bergman's point, that really the character of Esther is much more in need of help than those dwarves. Bergman has said that love has to be open, otherwise it leads to death. And I think that reminds us of The Silence, because the Esther character sinks towards death and by definition is left alone in the city at the end of the film, almost to die, and the sirens rise as we see her in the bedroom of the hotel. I think that Bergman is saying that while Esther has tried to project love to her sister, she's done it in a distorted way, in an almost perverted way, and she's unable really to express herself naturally as the son is. So the son of Anna is the hope for the future in that film. And that's why, although it's a very downbeat picture in many ways, it ends on a rising note, where just as Minos at the end of Through a Glass Darkly said, "Papa spoke to me," so he's looking and pronouncing the words that his Aunt Esther, who presumably is dying, has left for him, like a legacy. It's like a legacy she's given him, a testament almost, to take forward into his grown life.
Till Johan ord på det främmande språket. Det var ju snällt.
In The Silence, you have an almost acceptance that the world is shorn of faith, it's shorn of religion, and this mysterious city and hotel where the action unfolds, has very few elements of traditional religion or faith in them. Maybe in the painting we see on the wall, the sort of Rubens-type painting of satyr and nymph, but even that is almost pagan rather than Christian. So there is a gradual removal, I think, by the end of the silence, of the traditional Christian tenets which Bergman had referred to in so many films, whether it was The Virgin Spring and The Seventh Seal, or even Magician, and of course in Winter Light. By the end of the trilogy, he has really cleansed himself of this baggage which came to him from his strict upbringing in a Lutheran pastor's household.